Clara Bennett's hands were shaking when she dropped the tray of glasses, and the sound of shattering crystal echoed through the marble hallway like a gunshot. Clean it now. Vivian Cross did not even look up from her phone. She stood in the center of the grand foyer of the Moretti estate, wrapped in a cream silk robe that cost more than Clara made in 3 months, her voice sharp enough to cut glass on its own. Clara dropped to her knees immediately, gathering the broken pieces with bare fingers, wincing as a shard nicked her palm. She had been working in this house for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of learning which doors not to knock on, which hallways to avoid after midnight, and which woman in this house held more quiet danger than the armed men who stood at every entrance. Vivian was not the boss, not officially, but she wore his ring, and in this house, that was enough. From the hallway archway, a small voice rang out, clear and unafraid.
"Mommy, are you okay?"
Ruby Bennett, 3 years old, with a mess of brown curls and eyes far too sharp for her age, came padding across the marble floor in mismatched socks. She dropped down beside her mother without hesitation, small hands reaching for the broken glass. "No, baby, don't touch that, you'll cut yourself." Clara pulled her daughter's hands back gently, glancing up to see if Vivian had noticed the interruption. She had. Vivian's eyes flicked down at the child with the same expression she might give a stray cat that had wandered into her kitchen. "You brought your kid to work again." "I have no one else to watch her, Miss Cross. I'm sorry, she's quiet. She won't be any trouble." "She's already been trouble. Get her out of my sight before Damien sees her running around like she owns the place." Ruby did not flinch. She looked up at Vivian with the kind of directness that made grown men in this house lower their eyes, and said nothing, but she did not look away either. It was Vivian who broke the stare first, turning on her heel and disappearing down the hallway toward the west wing, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. Clara let out a breath she did not know she had been holding, and finished cleaning the glass, wrapping the shards carefully in a cloth so Ruby would not reach for them again. Her hands were still trembling, not from fear of the glass, but from 6 weeks of walking on a floor that felt like it could crack open beneath her at any moment. The Moretti estate sat on 11 acres just outside the city, surrounded by a stone wall high enough to keep out anyone who was not invited, and staffed by men who rarely spoke and never smiled. Clara had taken the job because the pay was good, the housing was included, and most importantly, no one asked too many questions about her past. She needed all 3 of those things badly. She had not expected to fall into the orbit of Damien Moretti. She had heard his name before she ever saw his face, whispered by the other staff in the kitchen with a kind of reverent fear. He ran things. Not just the house, but something much larger, something Clara did not fully understand, and did not want to. She had seen him only a handful of times since she started, always from a distance, always moving through the house like a shadow that everyone else seemed to bend around. Today was different. She was in the kitchen wiping down the counters, Ruby seated at the small table in the corner, with a coloring book Clara kept in her bag for exactly these moments, when the door swung open and Damien Moretti walked in. He was taller than she remembered, dressed in a dark gray suit despite the early hour, his jaw set in the permanent expression of a man who had not smiled in longer than Clara had been alive. He did not acknowledge her at first, moving toward the coffee machine with the easy familiarity of someone who had walked this same path 1,000 times. Then his eyes landed on Ruby. Clara froze, her cloth still pressed against the counter. Staff were not supposed to bring children into the main house. She had broken that rule out of necessity, and now the man who owned the house, who owned everything, was standing 3 feet away from her daughter. "Whose is this?" Damien said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. It was simply a question, delivered the way he probably delivered every question, expecting an answer immediately. "Mine, sir. I'm so sorry. I didn't have anyone to watch her today. It won't happen again. She's not bothering anyone." He said it flatly, cutting off her apology before it could finish forming. His eyes moved back to Ruby, who had looked up from her coloring book and was staring at him with the same unblinking curiosity she gave everyone in this house. "Hi," Ruby said. Clara's stomach dropped. Nobody spoke to Damien Moretti like that. Nobody spoke to him at all unless spoken to first. But Damien did not react the way she feared. Something shifted in his face, So brief Clara almost missed it, a flicker of surprise that softened the hard line of his mouth for half a second before it disappeared again. "Hello," he said back, and then, as if catching himself doing something unusual, he turned, took his coffee, and left the kitchen without another word. Clara exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the counter. "He's not scary," Ruby announced, going back to her coloring book as if nothing had happened. "He's your boss's boss's boss, sweetheart. Everyone here is a little scared of him." "I'm not." Clara almost laughed, except laughing felt dangerous in a house like this, where every sound seemed to travel further than it should. She crouched beside her daughter and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar smell of her shampoo, the one normal, unchanged thing in a life that had turned unrecognizable over the past year. She thought of the man she had run from, the reason she had taken this job under a slightly different last name, the reason she flinched every time a car idled too long outside the estate's gates. Ruby did not remember him. Clara made sure of that. She had built a wall around her daughter's world, a wall made of new names, new cities, and jobs like this one, where the pay was good enough that she never had to ask for help from anyone who might ask questions in return. The Moretti house was dangerous in ways Clara understood. It dealt in threats and power and men who disappeared without explanation, but it was also, strangely, one of the safest places she had ever lived, because nobody here would ever think to look for a runaway mother and daughter inside the walls of a mafia boss's estate. That afternoon, Clara was assigned to polish silver in the dining room, a task Vivian had specifically requested, according to the head housekeeper, Marta, who delivered the instruction with a look of quiet sympathy. "She likes to see people work while she eats," Marta said under her breath as she passed Clara the polishing kit. "Don't let her get to you." "I'll be fine. You have a kid to think about. Just keep your head down." Clara nodded, though the advice felt increasingly impossible to follow. She set Ruby up at the far end of the long dining table with a snack and her book, and began the slow, methodical work of polishing silverware that would likely never be used, in a house that seemed to exist more for display than for living. Vivian arrived 20 minutes later, taking her seat at the head of the table with a glass of wine, though it was not yet noon. She watched Clara work in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You know," Vivian said, swirling her wine, "Damien doesn't usually notice the staff. You should feel flattered he even looked at your daughter this morning." Clara kept her eyes on the silver spoon in her hands. "I didn't mean for her to be in his way, Miss Cross." She wasn't in his way. She was in his line of sight. "There's a difference, and it's one you should be careful about." Vivian's voice had dropped, quiet and precise, the way people spoke when they wanted a threat to sound like advice. "This house doesn't need distractions, especially not right before a wedding." "Of course, I understand." "Do you?" Vivian set her glass down with a small, deliberate click. "Because I've seen women like you before. Pretty face, sad story, convenient timing. Damien has a soft spot for strays. It's almost charming, until it becomes a problem." Clara's hands stilled on the silver. She was not sure what stopped her more, the accusation itself, or how close it landed to a truth she had not even admitted to herself yet. The flicker of warmth she'd felt when Damien said hello to her daughter that morning, gentle in a way nothing else in this house had been. "I'm just here to work," Clara said quietly. "Nothing more." "See that it stays that way." The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, though the weight of Vivian's words lingered over Clara like a held breath. She finished the silver, checked on Ruby twice more, and by the time evening came, she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. That night, after Ruby had fallen asleep in the small staff quarters they shared on the estate's edge, Clara sat by the window and watched the lights of the main house glow across the dark lawn. She thought about leaving. She thought about it often. Some new city, some new name, starting over yet again the way she had 3 times before. But then she thought about Ruby's laughter in the kitchen that morning, about the way Damien Moretti's face had briefly softened at the sound of her daughter's voice, and about the strange, fragile safety she had found inside walls built by a man everyone else feared. She did not know yet that Vivian's warning was not paranoia. She did not know that the flicker of gentleness she had glimpsed in Damien that morning would return again and again over the coming weeks, each time a little less guarded. And she certainly did not know that her daughter's fearless nature, the very thing Vivian saw as a threat, would soon become the spark that changed everything in this house. For now, she only knew that she was tired, that her daughter was safe and asleep, and that tomorrow she would wake up and do it all again, one careful day at a time, in a house where every silence held a warning, and every kindness came with a price she had not yet learned to count. Outside, a car pulled through the estate gates and idled near the staff entrance. Clara watched it from her window, her chest tightening the way it always did at unfamiliar headlights in the dark. A man in a dark coat stepped out, spoke briefly with one of the guards, and was waved through toward the main house. It was nothing, just another one of Damien's associates, arriving for a late meeting, the kind that happened often in a house like this. Still, Clara did not sleep easily that night. She lay awake listening to Ruby's soft breathing beside her, one hand resting protectively on her daughter's back, and wondered, not for the first time, how long she could keep running before the past finally caught up to the life she was so carefully trying to rebuild. The next morning came too fast, the way mornings always did when sleep had been thin and restless. Clara dressed quietly, packed Ruby's small backpack with crayons and a juice box, and walked the long gravel path from the staff quarters to the main house before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. Marta was already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flour dusted across the counter as she prepared bread for the morning. She glanced at Clara's tired face and did not ask questions, only slid a cup of coffee across the counter without a word. "Rough night?" Marta finally asked, once Ruby had settled at the corner table with her crayons. "Just couldn't sleep. This house does that to people. You get used to the quiet, and then you start hearing things in it that aren't really there." Marta wiped her hands on her apron and lowered her voice. "How long have you worked here now? 6 weeks?" "About that." "You're lasting longer than most. Miss Cross usually runs the new girls off within a month." Marta said it lightly, but there was something careful in the way she watched Clara's reaction, as though testing how much the younger woman already understood about the house she had walked into. "She hasn't been kind, if that's what you're asking. She's not kind to anyone who isn't useful to her. But you," Marta tilted her head toward Ruby, still coloring quietly in the corner. "You might be different. Kids have a way of getting past people's guards in this house, even his." Clara did not need to ask who Marta meant. She thought of the flicker in Damien's face the day before, the small, involuntary softness that had crossed it when Ruby said hello. She had told herself it meant nothing. She told herself that again now. "I'm not trying to get past anyone's guard," Clara said. "I just need this job." "I know. That's exactly why I'm telling you to be careful. Vivian doesn't like competition, real or imagined. And in a house like this, being noticed by the wrong person for the wrong reason can cost you more than your job." The warning settled uncomfortably in Clara's chest as she carried a tray of pastries toward the sitting room later that morning, where several men in dark suits had gathered for an early meeting with Damien. She kept her eyes low, setting the tray down quietly on the side table, careful not to interrupt the low, serious conversation happening around her. She caught only fragments: a shipment delayed, a name mentioned with tension, numbers spoken in a tone that made the hair on her arms rise. This was the part of the house she was never meant to see, the machinery running beneath the polished floors and crystal chandeliers, the reason armed men stood at every gate and every door stayed locked after dark. Damien's eyes lifted briefly as she set the tray down, meeting hers for the length of a single breath, before returning to the men seated around him. It was nothing, she told herself again. A boss noticing an employee doing her job, nothing more. But when she returned to the kitchen, her heart was beating faster than it should have been, and she did not entirely understand why. By mid-afternoon, Ruby had grown restless from sitting still, and Clara allowed her a short walk through the garden behind the kitchen, a walled space with neat rows of rose bushes and a stone fountain that had long since stopped running. Ruby chased a butterfly along the gravel path, her laughter the only sound of real joy Clara had heard inside these walls in weeks. It was there, in the quiet of the garden, that Damien found them. He walked with his jacket removed, sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking less like the untouchable figure from the sitting room and more like an ordinary man taking a break from an exhausting day. He stopped several feet away, watching Ruby chase the butterfly with an expression Clara could not quite read. "She's not afraid of anything, is she?" he said, more observation than question. "Not yet." Clara straightened, suddenly aware of how she must look, tired and worn in her plain uniform, standing in a garden that belonged to a world she did not fit into. "I try to keep it that way as long as I can." "Smart." Damien's gaze lingered on Ruby a moment longer, before shifting back to Clara. "Most people in this house learn fear quickly. It's rare to see someone who hasn't yet. She's 3. She doesn't understand what this place is. Do you?" The question landed heavier than she expected, and Clara held his gaze, unsure how honest she was allowed to be. "I understand enough to know which doors to avoid." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "That's a good start." He did not stay long after that, offering only a brief nod before turning back toward the house, his sleeves still rolled, his shoulders carrying the same quiet weight they always did. Clara watched him go, unsettled by how easily the conversation had happened, how ordinary it had felt for a few brief seconds, before remembering exactly who he was and exactly how dangerous ordinary could become in a place like this. That evening, as she tucked Ruby into bed in their small quarters, her daughter looked up at her with sleepy, thoughtful eyes. "Mommy, is the tall man nice?" Clara smoothed the blanket over her daughter's shoulders, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know yet, baby, but he was kind to you today." "I liked him," Ruby murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "He doesn't seem scary, just sad." Clara sat with that thought long after Ruby's breathing had evened into sleep, turning it over in the dark. Sad was not a word she would have chosen for a man like Damien Moretti, and yet, watching him in the garden, sleeves rolled, eyes lingering a moment too long, she wondered if her daughter, with her fearless, unfiltered way of seeing the world, had noticed something true that the adults around him had long since stopped looking for. Outside, the same car from the night before idled once again near the staff entrance, and Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest return, the reminder that whatever fragile calm she had found inside these walls, it was borrowed, temporary, and could be taken from her the moment the wrong door opened at the wrong time. The kitchen was warm from the ovens when Vivian Cross stormed in, her heels striking the tile with the fury of someone who had already decided how this moment would end. "Where is she?" Vivian demanded, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Clara, who stood at the counter with flour on her hands, halfway through preparing dough for the evening meal. "Miss Cross, is something wrong? You tell me. My emerald bracelet is missing from my dressing room, and you were the one cleaning it this morning." Clara's stomach dropped. She set down the rolling pin, wiping her hands quickly on her apron. "I didn't touch any bracelet, Miss Cross. I only cleaned the mirror and the floor, exactly like I was told." "That's convenient." Vivian's voice rose, sharp enough to cut through the kitchen's warmth like a blade through silk. "A missing piece of jewelry, and you're the only one who was in that room. Do you think I'm foolish enough not to notice? I promise you, I never went near your jewelry box." "Save it." Vivian stepped closer, close enough that Clara could smell the wine on her breath despite the early hour. "I want you gone by tonight. Packed, gone, off this property, before Damien even has to hear about this embarrassment." The accusation was baseless, and both women seemed to know it. But that did not matter in a house where Vivian's word carried the weight of law whenever Damien was not standing close enough to hear it challenged. Clara felt panic rising in her throat, thinking of Ruby, of the small quarters they shared, of the good pay that had let her breathe easier for the first time in over a year. "Please, Miss Cross. I need this job. I have a daughter to think about." "Then you should have thought about that before you decided to steal from me." It was at that exact moment that Ruby wandered in from the corner table, drawn by the raised voices, her small hand still holding a crayon. She stopped a few feet from her mother, looking up at Vivian with the same unblinking directness she had shown 2 days before. Except this time, there was something firmer in her 3-year-old face, something that had hardened at the sight of her mother's fear. "You can't control my mom." The words rang out clear and sudden, cutting through the tension in the kitchen like a struck bell. For a moment, nobody moved. Marta, who had been kneading dough at the far counter, froze mid-motion. Even Vivian, caught completely off guard, blinked down at the small child, as though she had never once considered that anyone in this house, let alone a toddler, might speak to her that way. "Excuse me?" Vivian's voice had lost some of its sharp edge, replaced by something closer to disbelief. Ruby did not back down. She stepped slightly in front of her mother's legs, chin lifted, crayon still gripped tightly in her small fist. "My mommy didn't take your bracelet. You're being mean. You can't control her. She's my mom, not yours." The silence that followed felt endless. Clara wanted to scoop her daughter up and disappear through the kitchen door, terrified of what Vivian's reaction might be, terrified that the small act of courage her daughter had just shown might cost them both everything. Then, from the doorway behind Vivian, a low voice broke the stillness. "What is going on in here?" Damien Moretti stood in the entrance to the kitchen, having arrived at some point during the confrontation without any of them noticing. His eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in Vivian's flushed anger, Clara's pale, trembling hands, and finally settling on Ruby, still standing protectively in front of her mother. Vivian recovered quickly, straightening her posture and smoothing the front of her dress. "Nothing, darling. Just a small misunderstanding with the staff. My bracelet is missing, and I was simply asking Clara if she'd seen it." "It didn't sound like a simple question," Damien said, his voice even, but carrying a weight that made Vivian's jaw tighten. It sounded like an accusation. "Damien, please. This isn't the time or place." "It's exactly the time and place, since I'm standing right here." He stepped further into the kitchen, his eyes moving to Clara. "Did you take the bracelet?" "No, sir. I would never. I only cleaned the room this morning. I never touched her jewelry." He studied her for a long moment, then turned to Marta. "Has anyone else been in and out of Vivian's dressing room today?" Marta hesitated, glancing nervously between Vivian and Damien before answering. "The window cleaners were scheduled for the east wing this morning, sir. They would have passed by that room." Vivian's face flickered, a brief crack in her composure before she smoothed it over again. "That's ridiculous. Those men have worked here for years. And Clara has worked here for 6 weeks, and has never given me a single reason to distrust her." Damien's tone remained calm, but there was an edge beneath it now, one that made even Vivian take a small step back. "I'll have the bracelet found. Until then, no one is packing anyone's bags." Vivian opened her mouth as if to argue further, then seemed to think better of it, casting one last cold look at Clara before turning and walking briskly out of the kitchen, her heels once again striking the tile like a countdown, though this time the countdown belonged to her instead. The kitchen exhaled as one once she was gone. Marta returned to her dough with visibly shaking hands. Clara sank into the nearest chair, pulling Ruby into her lap and holding her tightly, equal parts terrified and overwhelmed with a fierce protective pride she did not know how to put into words. "You shouldn't have said that, baby," Clara whispered into her daughter's hair, even as her arms tightened around her. "She was being mean to you," Ruby said simply, as though the matter required no further explanation. "I wasn't gonna let her." Marta crossed the kitchen and knelt beside them, resting a floury hand gently on Ruby's shoulder. "You've got more courage than half the grown men on this property, little one. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." She glanced up at Clara with a small, tired smile. "Your daughter just did something none of us have managed in 3 years of working for that woman." "I don't know whether to be proud or terrified," Clara admitted, her voice still unsteady. "Both, probably. That's usually how it works in this house." Damien had not yet left the kitchen. He stood near the doorway, watching the small scene with an expression Clara could not fully decode, something between amusement and something quieter, something that looked almost like respect. "She's braver than most of the men who work for me," he said finally. Clara looked up, unsure how to respond. "She doesn't know any better, sir. She doesn't understand what could have happened. Maybe not, but she wasn't wrong." He held Clara's gaze a moment longer than necessary. "Nobody in this house is going to control you, not while I have a say in it." The words settled over Clara in a way she was not prepared for. Warm and unfamiliar. A kindness so foreign in this house that she did not immediately know what to do with it. She managed a small, grateful nod, and Damien, seeming to catch himself lingering longer than he intended, gave a short nod in return, before turning and leaving the kitchen. The bracelet was found 2 hours later, tangled in the folds of a curtain in Vivian's dressing room, exactly where it had fallen when Vivian herself had tossed her jewelry box carelessly onto the window seat the night before. Marta delivered the news to Clara with poorly concealed satisfaction, though both women understood that an apology from Vivian would never come. It did not need to. Something in the house had shifted that afternoon, subtly but unmistakably, and everyone from the kitchen staff to the guards at the gate seemed to feel it. Vivian Cross had been embarrassed in front of Damien Moretti by a member of his own staff, and worse, by a 3-year-old child who had refused to be afraid of her. That evening, as Clara walked Ruby back toward the staff quarters under a darkening sky, she noticed Vivian watching them from an upper window of the main house, her silhouette still and sharp against the lit glass. Clara did not wave. She simply kept walking, holding Ruby's small hand a little tighter than usual. "Are we in trouble?" Ruby asked, sensing the tension even without understanding it. "No, baby, you did nothing wrong." Clara crouched down at the edge of the gravel path, brushing a curl away from her daughter's face. "But I need you to understand something. That woman, she's not someone we can be careless around. I know you were protecting me, and I love you for it, but you can't do that again. Not with her." "Why not? It worked. The tall man believed us." Clara did not have a good answer for that, mostly because her daughter was not wrong. Damien had believed them, had stood between Vivian's accusation and the truth, had done something no one else in this house would have dared to do. And that, Clara realized with a growing unease, was precisely the problem. Vivian did not strike again that night, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any confrontation might have been. Clara lay awake long after Ruby had fallen asleep, replaying the moment in the kitchen over and over, the sound of her daughter's fearless voice, the look on Damien's face when he defended her without hesitation, the cold fury behind Vivian's retreating footsteps. She thought about leaving again that night, packing their few belongings and disappearing before the sun rose, the way she had done twice before when danger had crept too close. But something held her in place this time, some fragile thread of hope she did not fully trust, woven from the memory of Damien's voice saying, "Nobody in this house is going to control you," and the warmth that had spread through her chest at hearing it. She did not yet understand how far that thread would stretch, or how much it would cost each of them, before the truth of Vivian's cruelty and the depth of Damien's protection was finally laid bare for the entire house to see. She only knew that for the first time in a long while, she had not felt entirely alone in a fight, and that feeling, however dangerous, was one she was not ready to let go of yet. The following morning, Clara was summoned to the small office off the main hallway, a room she had never once been asked to enter in her 6 weeks at the estate. Her pulse quickened as she knocked on the heavy wooden door, half expecting to find Vivian waiting inside with some new accusation. Instead, it was Damien, seated behind a wide desk covered in papers, a cup of black coffee cooling untouched beside his hand. He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up immediately. "Sit." Clara sat, smoothing her apron nervously over her knees, unsure what this meeting could be about. "Sir, if this is about yesterday, I promise you, Ruby didn't mean any disrespect. She's just a child, she doesn't understand. This isn't about that." He finally looked up, setting down the papers in his hand. "I wanted to ask how long you've worked in houses like this, domestic staff, I mean, before coming here." The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she considered giving a vague, practiced answer, the same kind of half-truth she had learned to offer whenever anyone asked too much about her past. But something about the quiet seriousness in his expression made her hesitate. "A few years, I moved around a lot before this. Different cities, different families." She chose her words carefully. It's easier work to find when you don't want anyone asking too many questions. And you don't want anyone asking questions. "No, sir." He studied her for a long moment, and Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the fear that she had said too much, revealed too much of the fault lines beneath the careful life she had built. But instead of pressing further, Damien simply nodded, as though her answer had confirmed something he already suspected. "You're good at your job. Marta tells me you're one of the most reliable people on staff, and that's not something she says about many people." He paused. I don't like what happened yesterday. Vivian shouldn't have accused you without proof, and she certainly shouldn't have done it in front of your daughter. She was upset about the bracelet. I understand. You're being generous. I don't think you need to be. Clara did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, watching him carefully instead, trying to understand what kind of man ran one of the most feared organizations in the city, and yet spoke so plainly about fairness in his own kitchen. I want you to know, Damien continued, that whatever happens between me and Vivian, it has nothing to do with your position here. You and your daughter are safe in this house. That's not something I say lightly. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes, before clearing his throat and returning his attention to the papers on his desk. The conversation apparently concluded. Clara rose, murmured her thanks again, and let herself out of the office, her heart beating unevenly, for reasons she did not want to examine too closely. That evening, Vivian sat alone in her dressing room, the recovered bracelet resting untouched on her vanity, no longer something she cared to wear. She had heard, through one of the maids who reported everything back to her, out of fear rather than loyalty, that Damien had called Clara into his office, alone, for nearly 20 minutes. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. She had spent 3 years building her place in this house, learning the rules of Damien's world, proving herself useful in ways that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with position, connections, and the kind of ruthless competence that men like Damien respected more than affection. She was not going to lose that place to a maid with a sharp-tongued toddler and a sob story written all over her tired eyes. Vivian rose from her vanity and crossed to the window, looking down at the staff quarters glowing faintly at the edge of the property. She did not yet have proof of anything improper between Damien and Clara, nothing beyond a lingering glance in the garden and a 20-minute conversation behind a closed door. But proof was not always necessary. Sometimes suspicion, planted carefully in the right ears, could do far more damage than the truth ever could. She thought of the other men in Damien's circle, the ones who whispered about loyalty and appearances, who would not take kindly to their boss showing favoritism toward a member of his own domestic staff, especially not one with an unexplained past, and a child who had humiliated Vivian in front of the entire kitchen. If she could not remove Clara through accusation, she would remove her through consequence, letting the wrong people notice the wrong things, until the decision to fire her came from somewhere Damien could not simply overrule. It was not an immediate plan. It would take patience, the kind Vivian had cultivated carefully, over years of navigating a world built on threats and favors. But patience, she reminded herself, swirling the last of her wine, had always been her greatest weapon, far sharper than any accusation a 3-year-old could shout down in a kitchen. 2 days passed in an uneasy quiet, the kind that settled over the estate like fog rolling in from the hills at dawn. Vivian kept to her wing of the house, emerging only for meals, her interactions with Clara reduced to icy silence rather than open confrontation. Clara told herself this was better. She told herself the danger had passed. She was wrong, though she would not understand exactly how wrong until the following week, when Vivian's wounded pride finally found a new, more calculated way to strike back. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the door of the head housekeeper's office, in a plain white envelope with no return address. Marta found it while sorting the morning mail, and read it twice before her face went pale. Clara, she called down the hallway, her voice tight with something between confusion and alarm. You need to see this. Clara set down the laundry basket she was carrying and crossed to the office, Ruby trailing a few steps behind with her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. Marta held out the letter without a word, and Clara's stomach dropped the moment her eyes reached the first line. It was an anonymous complaint, addressed to the estate's head of security, claiming that Clara Bennett had a criminal record under a different name, that she had lied on her employment application, and that her presence in the house posed a security risk given her unexplained past. None of it was entirely accurate, but enough of it brushed close to the truth to make Clara's hands go cold. She had changed her surname when she took this job, a small deception born entirely out of necessity, out of the desperate hope that a slightly different name might be enough to keep her hidden from a man she never wanted to see again. She had no criminal record. But the accusation did not need to be fully true to do damage. It only needed to raise a question loud enough for the wrong people to start asking it. "Who sent this?" Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer. "There's no name, no signature. It was just left under the door sometime last night." Marta's eyes were sympathetic but cautious. "Clara, I have to report this. It's protocol. Any security concern involving staff has to go to Damien directly." "I understand." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'll explain everything. I have nothing to hide, not really. I just needed a fresh start." But explaining herself would mean opening a door she had spent over a year trying to keep permanently shut. A door that led back to a man whose name she had not spoken aloud since the night she packed a single bag and left everything behind for Ruby's sake. She had never told anyone in this house the full truth, not even Marta, who had shown her more genuine kindness than most people she had met in years. She was called into Damien's office within the hour. This time, the room felt different, colder, though nothing about its furnishings had changed. Damien sat behind his desk with the anonymous letter spread out in front of him, his expression unreadable, in a way that frightened Clara more than open anger would have. "Sit down," he said, and she did, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. "I need you to tell me the truth," Damien said, his voice low and even. "All of it, right now." Clara took a breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "My name is Clara Bennett, that part is true, but it wasn't always my last name. I changed it about a year ago, when Ruby and I left the city we used to live in. Why? Because Ruby's father found out where we were, and I was afraid of what he'd do if he found us again." The words came out faster now, as though once the dam had cracked, the rest could not be held back. "He was never violent toward me while we were together, not physically, but he had a way of controlling everything, where I went, who I spoke to, what I did with my own money. When I finally left, he didn't take it well. He started showing up places he shouldn't have known about. I panicked. I changed our names, moved to a new city, and took whatever job would let me disappear the fastest." "And this job let you disappear?" "Yes, sir. I never thought anyone would come looking for me in a house like this. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth from the start. I was afraid that if anyone knew, I'd lose the one place that finally felt safe." Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Clara feel as though he were reading every unspoken fear beneath her carefully composed answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge, replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. "You should have told me sooner, not because I would have judged you for it, but because information like this, in a house like mine, is dangerous when it's hidden. People find things out eventually. And when they do, it's better if I already know the truth than if I'm caught by surprise the way I was this morning. I understand. It won't happen again. There's no record of any criminal history under either name. I already had that checked before you sat down." He tapped the letter on his desk. "This wasn't written by someone concerned about security. This was written by someone trying to get you removed from this house without leaving fingerprints." Clara's breath caught. "You think it was Vivian?" "I know it was Vivian." His jaw tightened, the first visible sign of real anger she had seen from him. "She's careful. She wouldn't have signed her name to something like this. But the timing isn't a coincidence, not after what happened in the kitchen last week. Sir, please. I don't want to cause problems between you and Miss Cross. If it's easier, I can find another position, somewhere else." "No." The word came out sharper than she expected, and he seemed to catch himself, softening his tone before continuing. "You haven't done anything wrong. I'm not going to let someone manipulate me into pushing out a good employee over an anonymous letter with no evidence behind it." The relief that flooded through Clara was almost dizzying, followed quickly by a fresh wave of fear, because she understood now that Damien's protection, however genuine, came with a cost. Vivian would not simply let this go. If anything, being caught, even without proof, would only make her more careful, more determined to find a way that could not be traced back to her. "There's something else," Damien said, his voice quieter now. "Ruby's father. Do you have any reason to believe he knows where you are now?" The question sent a chill down Clara's spine. "I don't think so. I've been careful. New name, new city, no social media, Nothing that could lead him here. Careful isn't the same as safe. If he's the kind of man who tracked you before, he may still be looking. Damien's expression hardened into something Clara had not seen from him before, a cold, protective focus that reminded her, suddenly and sharply, exactly what kind of power this man commanded. If he ever comes near this property, or near either of you, I will handle it personally. I want you to understand that. Clara did not fully understand yet how literally he meant those words, or how far his reach truly extended beyond the walls of this estate. She only knew that something in his voice, low and certain, made her believe him completely, in a way she had not been able to believe anyone in a very long time. She left his office with her heart pounding for entirely different reasons than when she had entered, torn between gratitude, fear, and a warmth she was increasingly unable to explain away as simple relief. Over the following days, the household settled into a strange new rhythm. Vivian's cold silence toward Clara deepened into something colder still, though she made no further open moves, no accusations, no confrontations in front of witnesses. Clara almost preferred the shouting. The quiet felt like waiting for a storm that had not yet decided where to land. Damien, meanwhile, began appearing in places Clara had not expected. He would linger near the kitchen in the mornings longer than his coffee required. He asked Marta questions about the household schedule that seemed designed more to track Clara's movements than out of any genuine managerial interest. Once, she found him crouched in the garden beside Ruby, helping her stack smooth stones into an uneven tower, his sleeves rolled up, his expression softer than Clara had ever seen it in the 6 weeks prior to that anonymous letter. "You're good with her," Clara said, watching from the garden path, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Damien glanced up, and for a moment, something almost embarrassed crossed his face, quickly replaced by his usual composure. "I don't have much practice, but she doesn't seem to mind my mistakes. She likes you." Clara hesitated, then added, quieter, "So do I. I mean, I trust you. With this, with everything." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than she intended, and Damien rose slowly to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees, his eyes never leaving hers. "That trust matters to me more than you probably realize." Neither of them said anything further, but the moment stretched long enough that Ruby, sensing the shift in her small, perceptive way, looked between the two adults with open curiosity before returning contentedly to her stone tower, entirely unaware that she had just witnessed the quiet, careful beginning of something neither Clara nor Damien was yet ready to name. That evening, as the sun set behind the estate's stone walls, Vivian stood once again at her upstairs window, watching the garden below, where Damien had spent nearly an hour that afternoon, longer than he had ever spent with her in recent memory. Her jaw was tight, her wine untouched on the sill beside her. The anonymous letter had failed, but Vivian had learned something important from its failure, something that would shape her next move far more carefully than the last. Direct attacks would not work, not while Damien remained determined to protect Clara out of some misplaced sense of fairness. If she wanted to remove the threat permanently, she would need to attack from an angle Damien could not defend against, one rooted not in accusation, but in exposure of whatever secrets Clara had not yet been forced to reveal. She thought of the fear that had flickered across Clara's face when the letter mentioned her past, however inaccurately. There was a story there, something buried deep enough that even an anonymous accusation had rattled her composure. Vivian intended to find out exactly what it was, and this time, she would not rely on rumors or forged suspicion. She would find the truth herself, and use it far more precisely than any anonymous letter ever could. 3 nights later, Vivian met with a man named Felix Doyle in a quiet restaurant across town, the kind of place with dim lighting and private booths where conversations were never overheard by accident. Felix had done work for the Moretti family before, quiet work, the kind that never appeared on any official record, and he listened patiently as Vivian slid a folded photograph of Clara across the table. "I want to know everything about her," Vivian said, "where she came from, who she's running from, and why she changed her name a year ago." "Everything." Felix studied the photograph, then looked up with the mild curiosity of a man who had learned long ago not to ask why his clients wanted the information they paid for. "This might take some time. People who change their names usually have good reasons for making themselves hard to find." I don't care how long it takes. I want it done quietly. Damien can't know about this. And if what I find makes him angrier at you than at her. Vivian's expression did not waver. Then I'll deal with that when it happens. Right now, I need leverage, and I intend to get it. Felix pocketed the photograph along with the envelope of cash Vivian slid across the table, promising results within the week. Vivian watched him leave the restaurant with a cold, satisfied calm settling over her, the first real progress she had made since the humiliation in the kitchen days before. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Clara found herself increasingly unable to ignore the shift happening around her, subtle as it was. Damien's presence in her daily routine had become something she noticed, something she looked forward to in ways she was not entirely comfortable admitting even to herself. He asked about her day. He remembered small details, Ruby's favorite color, the fact that Clara took her coffee black with a single spoon of sugar, details a busy, powerful man had no real reason to hold on to, and yet somehow did. One evening, after Ruby had fallen asleep early from a long afternoon of chasing butterflies in the garden, Clara found herself walking the estate's perimeter path alone, needing air, needing space to think through the tangle of fear and cautious hope that had taken root in her chest since the anonymous letter arrived. She was not surprised, exactly, when Damien's footsteps fell into step beside her a few minutes later, though her pulse quickened all the same. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "Too much on my mind." She glanced sideways at him, the moon casting soft light across the gravel path between them. "Can I ask you something, and you won't take it the wrong way?" "Go ahead. Why does any of this matter to you? My past, whether I'm safe, whether Vivian tries to push me out, I'm staff. This isn't usually something a man in your position concerns himself with." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed somewhere ahead on the dark shape of the tree line beyond the estate wall. "Honestly, I've asked myself the same question more than once this past week." He exhaled slowly. "I think it's because you and your daughter are the first genuine thing that's walked into this house in a very long time. Everyone else here wants something from me. Position, protection, money, influence. You've never once asked me for anything beyond fair treatment. That's not entirely true. I've asked you to keep my job, to not fire me over something I didn't do. That's not the same as wanting something from me. That's wanting to be treated the way anyone deserves to be treated." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I don't know what this is yet, Clara. I'm not going to pretend I do. But I know I don't want you to leave this house, and it's not because you're a good employee." The honesty in his voice left Clara momentarily speechless, standing there in the quiet dark with the weight of his words settling over her like something fragile and dangerous all at once. She thought of Vivian's warning weeks ago, about strays and convenient timing, and wondered, not for the first time, whether the warmth growing steadily between herself and Damien was a gift or the beginning of a far greater danger than anything Vivian alone could create. "I should get back," she said finally, though she made no immediate move to leave. "Ruby will wake up if I'm gone too long." "Of course." Damien nodded, though something in his expression suggested he understood exactly why she had chosen that moment to retreat. "Good night, Clara." "Good night." She walked back toward the staff quarters with her heart racing, equal parts thrilled and terrified by the quiet confession that had passed between them beneath the moonlight, entirely unaware that 3 streets away, in a dimly lit office above a closed pharmacy, Felix Doyle had already begun pulling threads that would soon unravel the careful, protective walls Clara had spent over a year building around herself and her daughter. It would only take him 4 more days to find the name she had been running from. Clara did not know any of this yet. That night, she lay awake long after returning to her small room, listening to Ruby's steady breathing and replaying every word Damien had spoken beneath the moonlight. Part of her wanted to believe that the fragile safety she had found in this house could last, that a man with his kind of power might actually be capable of protecting the two of them from a past that refused to stay buried. Another part of her, older and more cautious, whispered that safety built on someone else's protection was never truly safety at all, only a different kind of dependence, one that could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. She thought of her own mother, once telling her that the men who claim to want nothing in return are usually the ones who want everything: patience, simply being their preferred method of collection. Clara did not want to believe that of Damien, not after the steady, careful way he had defended her twice now without hesitation. But she had believed similar things once before, in a different city, with a different man, and that belief had nearly cost her everything. For now, she chose to hold on to the small, cautious hope that had begun growing since the day her daughter had stood fearlessly between her and Vivian's cruelty, and trust that whatever came next, she would not have to face it entirely alone. The morning had started ordinarily enough. Clara had walked Ruby to the kitchen for breakfast, exchanged a quiet smile with Damien over coffee that neither of them fully acknowledged in front of the other staff, and settled into the same steady rhythm that had defined the past week since Vivian's investigator began circling closer to secrets she had never meant to surface. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara had allowed herself to believe that perhaps the worst had already passed. The car had been parked across the street from the estate's front gate for nearly an hour when one of the guards finally noticed it. A dark sedan with tinted windows and no visible plates, idling in a spot that offered a clear view of the staff entrance. He radioed it in immediately, and within minutes, Damien himself was standing at the gate, watching the vehicle with narrowed, assessing eyes. Inside, Clara was in the middle of folding laundry when Marta rushed into the room, her face tight with worry. "Clara, you need to come see this." "See what?" "There's a car outside. Damien thinks it might be watching the property." Marta hesitated. "He's asking for you." Clara's hands went still, the folded towel slipping from her fingers. She knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, exactly who might be sitting in that car. She had felt this fear before, the particular flavor of dread that came from being found after working so hard to disappear. She found Damien near the front gate, his posture rigid, his jaw set in the same hard line she had seen the very first time she encountered him weeks ago. He turned as she approached, his expression softening only slightly. "Do you know that car?" Clara looked past him toward the street, and though the tinted windows made it impossible to see inside clearly, something about the shape of the vehicle, the particular make and model, sent a jolt of recognition through her chest. "I think so. It looks like a car Ruby's father used to drive." "Marcus Hale," Damien said, and Clara's head snapped toward him in shock. "How do you know that name?" "Felix Doyle isn't the only person capable of finding information quietly." Damien's expression was carefully controlled, though Clara could see the tension beneath it. "I had someone look into Vivian's activities after the anonymous letter arrived. Turns out she hired an investigator to dig into your past. That investigator's inquiries left a trail, and where there's a trail, other interested parties sometimes notice." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Vivian's search for leverage had inadvertently, or perhaps not so inadvertently, drawn attention back toward Clara from exactly the direction she had spent over a year trying to avoid. She led him here. Vivian led him straight to us. It's possible she didn't intend for it to happen this way, or she didn't care what happened, as long as it got you removed from this house. Damien's hands curled into fists at his sides before he consciously relaxed them. "Either way, that doesn't matter right now. What matters is keeping you and Ruby safe." As if summoned by the sound of his own name, the car door across the street opened, and a man stepped out onto the sidewalk, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a casual jacket that did little to disguise the tension coiled through his posture. Clara's breath caught the moment she saw his face, older than she remembered, harder around the eyes, but unmistakably Marcus. "Clara," his voice carried easily across the quiet street, calm in a way that felt far more threatening than shouting would have. "I've been looking for you for a long time." "You need to leave," Damien said, stepping slightly in front of Clara, his voice carrying the same cold authority she had heard him use only once before, during the meeting she had witnessed fragments of weeks ago. "This is private property." Marcus's eyes flicked over Damien with obvious assessment, clearly recognizing that he was not dealing with an ordinary employer. "This doesn't concern you, whoever you are. I'm here for my daughter. Clara took her without any right to, and I have every legal claim to see her." "You have no claim to anything," Clara said, finding her voice despite the tremor running through her hands. "You gave up any right to Ruby. The day you decided controlling me mattered more than actually being a father to her." That's not how I remember it. It doesn't matter how you remember it. It matters what actually happened. Clara's voice grew steadier with each word, fueled by over a year of fear finally finding an outlet. I'm not doing this here. I'm not doing this with you standing outside a place I finally felt safe in. Marcus took a step forward, and immediately two of the estate's guards moved into position near the gate, their presence a silent, unmistakable warning. Marcus stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took in the small show of force arrayed against him. You've made new friends, he said, glancing at Damien with something between suspicion and grudging recalculation. Powerful ones, from the look of it. I've made friends who understand what it means to protect people who don't deserve to be afraid anymore, Damien said quietly. You're going to get back in your car, and you're not going to come near this property again. If you have legal concerns about custody, you can pursue them through appropriate channels, with lawyers, in courtrooms, like any reasonable person would. Showing up outside a private residence, watching a child from a parked car, is not that. You think you can just tell me to leave? I know I can. Damien's voice did not rise, but something in its flat, absolute certainty made even Marcus hesitate. I know exactly who you are now, Marcus Hale. I know your employer, I know your financial situation, and I know enough about the last year of your life to understand that you are not a man who wants a prolonged confrontation with people who have far more resources and far less patience than you do. The threat, delivered without a single raised word, hung heavy in the air between them. Marcus's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking once more toward Clara, who stood tall despite the fear still coursing through her, before he finally took a step back toward his car. This isn't over, he said, though the certainty in his voice had noticeably thinned. It is for today, Damien replied, and if you're smart, it will stay over permanently. Marcus got back into his car without another word, the engine starting a moment later, the vehicle pulling away from the curb and disappearing around the corner. Clara did not move until the sound of the engine had faded completely, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. Damien turned to her immediately, his hand coming to rest gently on her shoulder. Are you all right? I don't know. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I haven't seen him in over a year. I thought I was ready if this ever happened, but I wasn't. I wasn't ready at all. You handled it better than most people would have. He guided her toward a bench near the gatehouse, sitting beside her, as her hands finally began to shake with the full weight of delayed shock. I meant what I said to him. He's not getting near you or Ruby again. Not while I have any say in what happens on this property or beyond it. You looked into him. Before today, I mean. Clara looked up at him, piecing together the timeline. You knew he might come here. I suspected it was a possibility. Once I learned Vivian had hired an investigator. I wanted to be prepared, in case her carelessness put you in danger. Something flickered across his face, guilt mixed with the same protective fury she had glimpsed moments earlier. I should have told you sooner. I didn't want to frighten you before I had something concrete to act on. Clara absorbed this, torn between gratitude for his protection and the lingering unease of realizing how much had been happening around her, without her full knowledge. But looking at him now, the tension still visible in his shoulders, the barely restrained anger in his eyes at the sight of a man threatening her, she found it difficult to hold on to any real resentment. I need to see Vivian, Clara said finally. I need to know exactly what she told that investigator, how much she gave away. You won't need to. I'm handling Vivian directly, tonight. Something in his tone made Clara look at him more carefully, and she realized, with a slow, dawning understanding, that whatever had been building between herself and Damien over the past weeks had reached a point where he was no longer willing to let Vivian's cruelty continue unchallenged, regardless of the engagement that technically still bound them together. That evening, Damien found Vivian in the estate's private sitting room, a glass of wine already in hand, her posture relaxed in the deceptive calm of someone who did not yet know how thoroughly her scheme had unraveled. You hired someone to investigate Clara, Damien said without preamble, closing the door behind him with a decisive click. Vivian's expression shifted, surprise quickly masked by practiced composure. I don't know what you're talking about. I know about Felix Doyle. I know what you paid him. And I know that your search led Marcus Hale directly to this property today, where he stood outside my gate, threatening a woman who has done nothing except try to protect her daughter. The color drained slowly from Vivian's face, though she recovered quickly, setting her glass down with deliberate control.
I didn't know that would happen. I only wanted to know why she was hiding something.
You wanted leverage. You got a dangerous man showing up at my front gate instead. Damien's voice remained level, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable now, filling the room like a physical presence. I've overlooked a great deal from you over the past 3 years, Vivian. Your temper, your cruelty toward the staff, your need to control everyone around you as though this house exists solely to reflect your own insecurities. But I will not overlook you endangering a child. Damien, please, be reasonable. This is about a maid. Why does this matter so much to you? Because she's not just a maid to me anymore, he said quietly, and the admission, once finally spoken aloud, settled into the room with the weight of a decision already made. And because even if she were, no one in my house deserves to be hunted, because your pride couldn't handle being outspoken by a 3-year-old. Vivian's face hardened, understanding finally dawning fully. You're choosing her. After everything I've built with you, everything I've sacrificed to be the right partner for this life, you're choosing a maid and her child. I'm choosing basic decency, Vivian. Something you stopped understanding a long time ago. Damien's voice softened only slightly, the closest thing to gentleness he could offer in a moment, that clearly still carried the residue of whatever affection had once existed between them. This engagement is over. I'll have arrangements made for you to leave the estate by the end of the week. Vivian said nothing for a long moment, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking at the edges, revealing something rawer and more desperate underneath. You'll regret this. She'll disappoint you eventually, they always do. Maybe, but at least it will be an honest disappointment, not a manufactured one, built on cruelty toward someone who can't fight back the same way you can. Damien turned toward the door, pausing only briefly. I'd start packing tonight, Vivian. I don't think either of us wants this to drag out any longer than it has to. He left her standing alone in the sitting room, her wineglass still untouched on the table, the sound of the door closing behind him, marking the end of an engagement that had never truly been built on anything as fragile and necessary as trust. Later that night, Clara sat with Ruby in their small quarters, the events of the day finally settling into something manageable, now that the immediate danger had passed. A soft knock came at the door, and she opened it, to find Damien standing in the hallway, looking more exhausted and more open than she had ever seen him. I ended things with Vivian tonight, he said simply. Clara's breath caught. Damien, I don't want to be the reason. You're not the reason. She gave me plenty of reasons over the years. You just happened to be the one who finally made me stop ignoring them. He held her gaze steadily. I know this is a lot. After everything that happened today with Marcus, I'm not asking you for anything right now, except to know that whatever comes next, you and Ruby are not facing it from the outside of this house anymore. You're not staff to me. You haven't been for a while. Clara felt tears gathering unexpectedly, the accumulated weight of fear, exhaustion, and cautious hope, finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained all day. I don't know how to do this. Trusting someone. Letting someone protect us. It's been so long since I let myself believe that was possible. You don't have to know how yet. Damien reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek, with a tenderness that felt entirely unfamiliar in a house built on power and fear. We can figure it out together, one day at a time, the same way you've been surviving this whole time. Except now, you won't be doing it alone. Behind them, Ruby appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, looking between the two adults with the same fearless clarity she had shown from the very beginning. Is the bad man gone? Yes, baby, Clara said softly, pulling her daughter close. He's gone. We're safe. Ruby looked up at Damien with a small, satisfied nod, as though the matter had been settled entirely according to her expectations. Good. I knew you'd fix it. Damien knelt down to her eye level, something warm and unguarded crossing his face in a way Clara suspected very few people in his life had ever been allowed to witness. I'll always try to fix it, as long as you'll let me. Ruby considered this with the serious deliberation only a 3-year-old could bring to such a promise, then nodded once, decisively, before yawning and burying her face against her mother's shoulder, already drifting back toward sleep. entirely unaware that her fearless declaration weeks earlier in a crowded kitchen had set into motion the very thing that now stood protecting her in the quiet hallway of a house that finally, truly, felt like it could become home. Clara carried her daughter to bed and tucked the blanket around her small shoulders, lingering a moment longer than usual to watch her sleep, the tension of the day slowly draining from her body. When she returned to the doorway, Damien was still there, leaning against the frame, watching her with an expression she was only beginning to learn how to read. "You should get some rest too," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will bring its own difficulties. Vivian won't leave quietly, whatever she said tonight. I'm not afraid of her anymore, not after today." Clara crossed her arms, though the gesture felt more thoughtful than defensive now. "I spent so long being afraid of everyone, Marcus, Vivian, even you, in a strange way, when I first started this job. I don't think I know how to stop bracing for the next threat. Then we'll figure that out too, slowly." He straightened from the doorframe, his hand finding hers gently in the quiet of the hallway. "You don't have to trust all of this at once. Just trust today. Trust that today, you and Ruby are safer than you were yesterday, and that tomorrow, I intend to make sure that stays true." Clara studied their joined hands, still unfamiliar with how natural it felt, how much of the fear that had defined the last year had quieted, at least for tonight, into something that resembled the beginning of peace. "Thank you. For today. For all of it. You don't need to thank me for choosing to do the right thing." His voice softened further. "Get some sleep, Clara. I'll have extra security posted near the staff quarters tonight, just as a precaution. Nothing more is going to touch you or Ruby while I'm still standing." She believed him, more fully than she had allowed herself to believe anyone in longer than she could remember, and as she finally closed the door and settled into bed beside her sleeping daughter, she felt, for the first time since fleeing her old life over a year ago, something dangerously close to hope. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, pulling Damien out of a rare, uninterrupted sleep with the kind of urgency that never brought good news in his line of work. He answered on the second ring, his voice immediately alert. "It's handled," Felix Doyle said on the other end of the line. "Marcus Hale won't be a problem for Clara again." Damien sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. "Explain. Turns out your Mr. Hale has a habit of borrowing money from people far less patient than you. I made a few calls this morning, let the right people know exactly where they could find him, and reminded them that a man distracted by a custody dispute makes for an easy target when it comes to collecting old debts. He left the city 2 hours ago. My sources say he's not planning on coming back, not to this city, and definitely not anywhere near your estate. You didn't hurt him. Didn't need to. Fear works faster than force most of the time, and Marcus Hale is a man who understands fear very well, considering how much of it he's used against other people over the years." Felix paused. He also received a very clear message that if he ever attempts contact with Clara Bennett or her daughter again, in any form, the people currently overlooking his debts will stop overlooking them entirely. Damien exhaled slowly, some of the tension that had settled into his shoulders the previous day finally beginning to ease. "Good work. Send me the invoice." He hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of his bedroom, watching the first gray light of dawn filter through the curtains, thinking of Clara's face the night before, the careful, cautious hope she had allowed herself to show for the first time since he had known her. He intended to make sure that hope had every reason to grow into something permanent. By the time he made his way down to the kitchen, Marta was already at work, and Clara stood near the counter helping Ruby into her small chair for breakfast, the morning routine unfolding with a kind of fragile normalcy that had been entirely absent the day before. "Good morning," Damien said, and Clara looked up, a small, genuine smile crossing her face that had nothing to do with the careful, professional expression she used to offer him during her first weeks in this house. "Good morning." She studied his face, sensing immediately that something had shifted. "You have news. Marcus won't be coming back. Not to this city. Not near you or Ruby." Damien kept his voice level, though the weight of what he was delivering settled heavily in the quiet kitchen. He's been reminded of certain financial obligations that make returning here a very poor decision for him. Clara's hand came to her mouth, relief flooding through her so suddenly that she had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. It's really over. It's really over. Damien crossed the kitchen and rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore, Clara. Not for him. Marta, pretending not to eavesdrop from the far side of the kitchen, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she continued preparing breakfast, glad to see some measure of peace finally settling over a household that had spent the past several weeks tangled in tension and fear. Later that morning, Damien called a small meeting with the senior members of his household staff and a few of his closest associates, the same men who had gathered in the sitting room weeks earlier during the meeting Clara had glimpsed only in fragments. He explained, plainly and without room for argument, that Clara Bennett and her daughter were under his direct protection, that any further attempts to investigate, threaten, or destabilize their place in his household would be treated as a direct challenge to him personally. The room absorbed the announcement, with the quiet, immediate respect that years of loyalty had built, no questions asked, no objections raised. It was a small thing, perhaps, to an outsider, a few sentences spoken in a formal meeting. But Clara understood, once Marta relayed the details to her later that afternoon, that Damien had just done something far larger than simply defending her from Vivian's schemes. He had declared, publicly and unmistakably, that she belonged in this house, not as a temporary convenience or a passing interest, but as someone whose safety mattered as much as his own. The peace, however, was not yet complete. By mid-morning, word had spread through the estate that Vivian was packing her belongings, her departure arranged with the cold efficiency of a woman who understood that lingering any longer would only deepen her own humiliation. Clara caught sight of her only once, crossing the main hallway with 2 suitcases trailing behind her, her face set in a rigid mask that offered no glimpse of whatever she truly felt about losing everything she had spent years building. Vivian paused when she noticed Clara watching from the kitchen doorway, and for a moment, something almost vulnerable flickered across her expression before the familiar coldness reasserted itself. I hope you understand what you've taken on, Vivian said, her voice quieter than Clara had ever heard it, stripped of its usual sharp edges. This life, this world he's part of, it isn't safe, it isn't gentle. I spent 3 years learning how to survive in it, and even that wasn't enough in the end. I'm not trying to survive it the way you did, Clara said carefully. I'm not trying to control it or use it. I just want a safe place for my daughter. Then I hope, for both your sakes, that's enough. Vivian's gaze drifted briefly toward the kitchen table, where Ruby sat coloring, entirely unaware of the quiet exchange happening a few feet away. She's a remarkable child, fearless in a way most adults in this house have long forgotten how to be. Take care of that. Don't let this life take it from her, the way it eventually takes everything else. It was the closest thing to kindness Vivian had ever offered, and Clara found herself unable to respond with anything beyond a small, uncertain nod before Vivian turned and continued down the hallway, her suitcases rolling behind her, disappearing from the estate and from their lives without another word spoken between them. The following weeks unfolded with a gentleness Clara had almost forgotten was possible. Damien's presence in her daily life shifted openly now, no longer confined to careful, measured interactions meant to avoid suspicion. He joined her and Ruby for dinner most evenings. He learned the rhythms of Ruby's bedtime routine, the specific way she liked her stuffed rabbit tucked beside her pillow, the 3 books she insisted on hearing before finally drifting to sleep. He was patient in ways Clara had not expected from a man who commanded such absolute authority everywhere else in his life. One evening, nearly a month after Vivian's departure, Damien found Clara in the garden where their careful, quiet connection had first begun to bloom weeks earlier. Ruby was chasing fireflies near the stone fountain, her laughter carrying warm and unguarded through the cooling evening air. I've been thinking, Damien said, joining Clara on the garden bench, about what happens next, for all of us. What do you mean? I don't want you living in the staff quarters anymore. Not because your work isn't valued, but because I don't want to pretend anymore that this is simply an employer looking out for an employee. He turned to face her fully, something vulnerable crossing his expression that she had rarely seen from him. I want you and Ruby to move into the main house. Properly. Not as staff, but as the family I'd like us to become, if you're willing. Clara's breath caught, the weight of what he was offering settling over her slowly. carefully, the way sunlight spreads gradually across a room at dawn. "Damien, that's a huge step. Ruby and we've been running for so long, I don't know if I know how to stop and just exist somewhere without waiting for the next thing to go wrong. I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I know that instinct kept you and Ruby safe for a long time, and I respect it too much to ask you to abandon it entirely." His hand found hers on the bench between them. "I'm asking you to let yourself believe, even just a little, that this house, that I, can be somewhere you don't have to run from anymore." Ruby, drawn by the quiet seriousness in the conversation, wandered over from the fountain, a firefly cupped gently between her small hands. She looked between the two adults with her usual unblinking directness, before setting her makeshift lantern down on the bench and climbing up between them without hesitation. "Are we staying?" she asked, looking up at Damien with wide, hopeful eyes. "Would you like that?" Damien asked gently. Ruby considered the question with the same serious deliberation she had once given to the promise of being fixed, her small face scrunched in thoughtful concentration. "Yeah, I like it here. You're nice, and you don't yell like the bracelet lady did." Clara laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her with its genuine, unguarded warmth. "She means Vivian, in case that wasn't clear." I gathered. Damien's mouth curved into something close to a real smile, rare and quietly beautiful in the fading evening light. He looked at Ruby, then at Clara, and something settled in his expression, a decision made fully and without reservation. Then it settled. This is home now, for all of us. Ruby beamed, satisfied entirely with the resolution, and settled comfortably between them on the bench, watching the last of the evening's fireflies drift lazily across the garden. Clara leaned her head against Damien's shoulder, allowing herself, finally, fully, to believe in the fragile, hard-won peace that had grown from a single fearless declaration, spoken weeks earlier in a crowded kitchen. 6 months later, the estate looked different in ways both large and small. The cold, formal distance that had once defined every room had softened into something warmer, filled now with the sound of a child's laughter, echoing down hallways that had once known only tension and careful silence. Marta often remarked, with quiet satisfaction, that she had never seen Damien smile as often as he did now, nor seen the house itself feel so genuinely alive. Clara no longer worked as staff, though she had insisted on staying involved in the household in smaller, more comfortable ways, helping Marta in the kitchen some mornings, simply because she enjoyed it, not because her survival depended on it. The distinction mattered to her more than Damien had initially understood, and he had come to respect it deeply, recognizing in her insistence on independence the same fierce resilience that had first drawn him to her all those months ago. Marta had become something like family herself in those months, no longer just the head housekeeper who had quietly watched over Clara during her most difficult weeks in the house, but a steady, trusted presence who often sat with Clara in the evenings, sharing tea and easy conversation long after Ruby had gone to bed. It was Marta who first noticed the way Damien's shoulders relaxed the moment he walked through the door each evening, the way his eyes softened the instant he heard Ruby's laughter echoing down the hall. She never said much about it directly, only offering Clara small, knowing smiles whenever the subject came up, content simply to watch the transformation unfold in her own quiet way. Ruby had grown too in ways that went beyond the simple passage of months. She had started asking questions about the world beyond the estate walls, curious in the fearless, unguarded way that had defined her from the very beginning, no longer shadowed by the quiet caution Clara had once tried so carefully to instill in her. She spoke of Damien easily now, without hesitation, weaving him naturally into the small stories she told about her days, the way any child speaks of a parent who has simply always been there. Clara found herself, more often than not, standing at the edge of some ordinary moment, watching her daughter and the man she had once feared might be dangerous to know, and marveling quietly at how thoroughly her life had been rebuilt from the fear that had once defined every single day. On a warm afternoon in early autumn, Damien knelt in the garden beside Ruby, now 4 years old and just as fearless as the day she had first declared, with unwavering conviction, that nobody could control her mother. He held a small velvet box in his palm, waiting for the right moment, the right words, though he suspected none of it would matter nearly as much as the simple truth he intended to speak. "Ruby," he said, drawing her attention away from the stone tower she had been carefully building, "I want to ask you something important." She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes, setting down her stones with the same serious attention she gave every matter she considered significant. "I want to ask your mom to marry me. But I wanted to ask you first, because your opinion matters just as much as hers does in this family." He held her gaze steadily. "Would that be okay with you?" Ruby considered the question for a long moment, her small face scrunched in thoughtful deliberation, before breaking into a wide, delighted smile. "Does that mean you'll be my dad for real? If you'll have me." "Yeah." She threw her arms around his neck without hesitation, the same fearless certainty she had shown from their very first meeting in the garden months ago. "I already kind of call you that in my head anyway." Damien's throat tightened unexpectedly at the admission, holding her small frame close for a long moment, before setting her gently back down, watching as she immediately returned to her stone tower with the easy resilience of a child who had finally found solid ground beneath her feet. That evening, as the sun set warm and golden over the estate's stone walls, Damien found Clara in the kitchen, exactly where their story had first begun months ago, in fear and uncertainty. He crossed the room, knelt down beside her, and opened the small velvet box, watching her eyes widen with a mixture of shock and overwhelming emotion. "I already asked Ruby," he said softly. "She said yes on both our behalf, technically, but I'd still like to hear it from you." Tears gathered in Clara's eyes as she looked between the ring and the man who had, against every fear and every hard-learned instinct to keep running, become the safest, steadiest presence in her and her daughter's life. "Yes, of course, yes." From the kitchen doorway, Ruby watched with unrestrained joy, clapping her small hands together, entirely certain, in the fearless, unwavering way that had defined her from the very beginning, that everything in their world had finally, truly, fallen into place exactly as it should. The house that had once echoed with cold silence and careful fear now held something far more lasting. A family built not from power or position, but from courage, honesty, and the quiet, steady kind of love that had grown slowly from a single, fearless declaration spoken by a child who had never once doubted what she deserved to protect.